When we see a city hit by a huge flood or a devastating earthquake, our first instinct is to call it a natural disaster. Just bad luck, right? But what if it's not? What if these disasters that seem to be getting worse and more frequent are actually the predictable result of a massive gamble we're all taking? Let's break down this huge gamble we're all a part of. To get us started, here's a number: 1.4 million. The World Bank tells us that's how many people are moving into cities every single week. I mean, think about that. This incredible migration is reshaping our world faster than ever before. And all that growth, well, it forces us to ask a really critical question. As we're building out these cities of the future, are we actually engineering them to be safe and resilient? Or are we just, without even realizing it, building bigger and bigger disasters waiting to happen? To answer that, we've got to look beyond just the weather. The real truth about what puts our cities at risk, well, it's a lot deeper and way more complex than you might think. Okay, so the usual suspect, right? It's always climate change. And don't get me wrong, it's a huge factor. It's like the amplifier, turning up the volume on storms, floods, and fires. But as a Canadian government report on national risks points out, climate change is just one of several key risk drivers. It is definitely not the whole story. So what are these risk drivers anyway? Well, the true risk of a disaster isn't just the hazard itself, like a flood. It's more like a formula. You take the hazard, you multiply it by our exposure to it, and then you multiply that by our vulnerability when it hits. Risk drivers are all the things that crank up the numbers on the exposure and vulnerability side of that equation. And here's the thing. These key risk drivers, they aren't acts of nature. They're all about us. These are conscious decisions we make. Letting cities sprawl without a plan into dangerous areas, relying on maps that are totally out of date, letting economic pressures win out over safety, and failing to enforce the building codes we already have. These are all human choices. So let's dig into the biggest one first, the long history of how, and more importantly, where we've decided to build our modern cities. Here's the fundamental problem, plain and simple. We consistently build in the wrong places. As our cities boom and all the safe land gets bought up, new developments, new homes, new schools, new businesses get pushed right into harm's way. We're talking places we used to know better than to build on, like floodplains and right on top of fault lines. And look, the data on this is just, wow, it's really stark. A study in the journal Nature tracked where we've been building since 1985. In fairly well-off countries, building in safe zones grew by about 96%. But check this out. In high-hazard flood zones, it grew by 184%. We're not just building in risky areas, we're building there almost twice as fast. It's wild. Which leads to the million-dollar question, right? Why? If we know these places are dangerous, why on earth do we keep making the same risky choices again and again? Well, it's this weird mix of forgetting the lessons from the past and just giving in to the economic pressures of today. Let's take Toronto. Back in 1954, Hurricane Hazel hit and 81 people died. The city learned a hard lesson and banned any new development in the floodplains. Fast forward to today, and as one CBC report found, many cities are relying on flood maps that are decades out of date. Why? Because politically and economically, putting out new flood warnings can tank property values and scare off the development that cities want. And this whole problem? It gets even tougher in the parts of the world that are growing the fastest. According to the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction, in a lot of developing countries, the very rules designed to keep people safe, like building codes and land use regulations, either don't exist at all or they're just flat out ignored. And the results of that is, well, it's predictable, and it's absolutely tragic. When a massive 7.8 magnitude earthquake hit Nepal in 2015, almost 9,000 people were killed. See, it wasn't just the shaking of the ground that was so deadly. It was the thousands of buildings that just crumbled because they weren't built properly. It turned a natural hazard into a massive and largely preventable human catastrophe. So let's zoom out a bit. Where do these choices actually hit the hardest? Because the consequences, the real human cost, are not spread equally around the world. Okay, this right here is one of the most sobering statistics you'll see on this topic. Since 1990, a staggering 90% of all deaths from disasters have happened in low and middle income countries. Think about that, 90%. It's the clearest proof you'll ever see that it's rarely the hazard itself that kills people. It's the vulnerability we've built right into our societies. And this pattern isn't just a global thing. It exists even inside wealthy nations. In Canada, for instance, research has found that the urban neighborhoods with the highest flood risk are more likely to be home to marginalized groups and also have infrastructure that's in worse shape. Risk is a social issue just as much as it's a geographic one. And while we're talking about these huge systemic problems, they have incredibly real consequences for everyday people. A homeowner named Bev Silva, who lost her home to 3 separate floods, gave this really simple but powerful advice. Do your research. Find out what the neighbors have been through. It's a wake-up call to understand the hidden history of the place you want to call home. Okay, I know this all sounds pretty heavy, but here's the good news. And it is good news, because we've talked about the problems, now we can talk about the solutions. Let's look at the blueprint for how we can build safer, more resilient cities for everyone. The single most important thing to remember here is this. Because these are largely human-made problems, they have human-led solutions. That vulnerability we've built into our cities, it isn't permanent. We absolutely have the tools and the know-how to build a safer future. And really, it all boils down to a pretty straightforward 3-step plan. First, we need to actually see the risk. That means creating and using modern, up-to-date risk maps that everyone can access. Second, we have to build for that risk with strong building codes that are actually enforced. And third, we have to work together. This isn't just a government job. It means everyone, from national leaders down to local neighborhood groups, has to be part of the solution. And we know this stuff works. This isn't just a theory. We've seen it succeed all over the world. Japan is constantly updating its incredible building codes based on the latest science. In northern Pakistan, they've embraced traditional earthquake-resistant building techniques. And, like we saw, Toronto learned its lesson and banned building in the most dangerous spots. So when you boil it all down, right, our most powerful tools are actually pretty simple. Smart land use planning that basically just says, nope, we're not going to build there. Strong building codes that make sure what we do build can actually stand up to a punch. And clear, easy-to-get information about risks so that everyone can make smarter, safer choices. And that brings us to the crucial point, the big takeaway from all of this. The events we call natural disasters, they are very rarely just natural. More often than not, they are the predictable result of decades of our own choices, where we decide to live, how we decide to build, and who we decide to leave unprotected. So with 124 million more people crowding into cities every week, the ultimate question isn't if the next hazard will strike. It's, are we ready? Have we finally started making the right choices to be prepared when it does? It's worth asking, right? What choices is your community making?